You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by transit expert and former general manager for 3 transit systems, Ron Kilcoyne. Ron joins us to talk about the importance of running frequent transit service in order to attract riders and how agencies in the Bay Area are underserving the population. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. The weather is changing as we head towards winter, and you know what that means. It's gonna get cold. And scarf weather is here. We've got red bus scarves and green bike scarves, so pick one up to keep you warm on your journey to work or to advocate at a public meeting. These soccer-style scarves can be held up above your head to share your love of bus and bike lanes, and I hope you pick one up for the fall. To get one for you or for a friend, go to theoverheadwire.com and order one today. 5% discount if you order 5 or more. Just send me an email, theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and we can get that set up for you. Otherwise, go to theoverheadwire.com. Well, Ron Kilcoyne, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I have been a transit professional for about 43 years. I started my career as a planner at AC Transit in Oakland, California, was there 12 years. Then I moved around the country doing transit general manager gigs in Santa Clarita, California, Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Eugene, Oregon. And after retiring from LTD in Eugene, Oregon, I became a full-time consultant. Currently, I am senior manager with TMD, which stands for Transit Management Design, and we are a service planning consultancy.
So I'm curious about your time at some of the other agencies. You know, you've been heads of agencies on both coasts, and now you're obviously consulting. Mm-hmm. But what's something people might not know or understand about small to medium-sized transit systems?
Well, first of all, I would say that the 3 systems I managed were totally different from each other. Santa Clarita was an ex-urban. In fact, it was a new system. I was the first manager there. By the time transit was established in Santa Clarita, which is in northern Los Angeles County for people that don't know where Santa Clarita is, it's along I-5 as you leave the LA basin. The population had already grown to 150,000 without any transit service. Bridgeport was a classic, sort of old industrial city that's seen better days. It was all located in Fairfield County, which is one of the most affluent counties in the country, but Bridgeport probably had more in common with Detroit than it did with the rest of Fairfield County in terms of, it was the arsenal of democracy during World War II, and most of those factories were abandoned. And LTD was a college town, at the University of Oregon. LTD, at the time I was there, was 19th in terms of per capita ridership of all transit systems in the United States, and also in the top 25 in terms of overall system productivity. So smaller systems are unique to their particular areas that they serve. But I think some of the principles of transit, whether it's in a small community or a large community, are still the same in terms of, you need to provide frequency, you need to provide service span, you need to provide quality service. Smaller systems tend not to have the resources that larger systems have, or the staffing necessarily that large systems have. Right now, as a consultant, I'm doing a transit development plan for Great Falls, Montana. And I was just there last week. And, technologically, they're behind the times, but they're sort of like a mom and pop transit operation, but they do a great job. They are very customer friendly. They've regained mostly all of their pre-pandemic ridership. The riders really love the service. It's a really good operation. They may not have all the bells and whistles, but they're doing a good job, serving the community. And they also do one thing that, as a consultant, we always try to fix when we get into smaller systems. If you have giant one-way loops, that's very unattractive to the customer, because If it takes an hour to make a round trip when you could probably make it even on transit, a round trip in 20 minutes, that's obviously inconvenient. But Great Falls, they've got bidirectional routes, which means making the round trip is double making the one-way trip and not 3 times as much. But the lack of resources is probably the biggest challenge to smaller systems. They may not be able to justify running the same frequency that a big city has because they don't have the density, but they do need to be providing bidirectional service at least every half hour, and many don't have the resources to do that.
Yeah. We'll talk about the principles later, which talks about those loops specifically. But I want to go back in time a little bit and ask you, what got you into transit? Like, what was the thing that got you interested in transportation and transit policy and those types of things?
I always say it's prenatal because my mom said that when she was pregnant with me, the only time I ever kicked was when she was riding the train to and from work. But in reality, I grew up in a household down the peninsula. I didn't drive. We didn't have a car. So it was dependent on public transportation. And I was actually riding the bus alone as young as 6 because my parents wanted me to go to a Catholic school and our parish didn't have it. And so I meant I had to go from San Bruno to Burlingame on what was then the Greyhound buses, now Samtrans. My dad was a mailman in San Francisco in sort of the Outer Mission, 29th, 30th Street. So once or twice every summer, my mom would walk me to the bus stop and I'd ride up to San Francisco. My dad would meet me and I'd walk the rest of his route. So I'm aware because a lot of people got in transit, have this story about how it was accidental. In my case, I actually became fascinated with transportation, started collecting timetables when I was young, and always felt I could do a better job. Always kind of thought that, the service is crappy and I could do a better job. I'm probably one of these few people that actually aspired to be a transit general manager as a kid, even though I didn't know it was a career path. I mean, if anyone asked me what I wanted to do as a kid, I'd say there was a phase I wanted to be a priest, and then that stopped once I hit puberty. But or a lawyer, fascinated with Perry Mason and that. And my mom said, "Well, you're so into transportation. Why don't you get into that?" And I think, well, to me, that was like a fun thing. Work is a job and not that. But so, yeah, I've always been interested in it and eventually managed to get a job. But when I was in college, I would take every opportunity to write a paper on transportation, not necessarily transit, but transportation. And I also, times when I didn't have a paper to write, I would call up people at local transit systems and say I was writing a paper just to get in and talk to them. And, at that time, this was the early 70s, people were saying, wow, now there's no career, there's no future for transit. It's going to die and forget it. Think of something else to do. And if you want to get in transit, you got to be a bus driver first. That's the only way to work up way up. So I got some discouraging words, but I persevered and we're here today, still doing it.
That's awesome. Well, so I want to ask a basic question first. I hope it's basic anyways, but maybe it's more complicated than we think. But I want to know why transit service is important.
Well, transit can provide a lot of benefits to the community. For one thing, it provides access. And I like to use access instead of mobility because to me, it is about accessing opportunities, accessing employment, accessing healthcare, accessing education, accessing retail, accessing social opportunities. And number one, there are a number of people who don't have a driver's license or don't have a car. But also because we have built communities where you have to get around with a car, that means that kind of limits the freedom, limits the accessibility for people that don't have cars or driver's license. But more importantly, we just cannot sustain the high level of vehicle miles traveled that an auto-centric communities provide. There's a number of studies that have shown that simply electrifying all of our cars and trucks and buses is not enough to address climate change, deal with climate change. We have to reduce vehicle miles traveled. The fact is congestion is because we just quite often, it could be a sign of good economic vitality, but at the other hand, it's a sign that there's just too many cars out there. So for the sake of the environment, for the sake of the economy, for the sake of social cohesion, we need to give people choices and we need to give people alternatives so that they don't have to own a car, which, as I think some of your articles that I've seen in Overhead Wire and Streets Blog and what have you lately show that the price of a car is getting out of hand, the price of housing is getting out of hand. so people, don't have to be forced to have a car to get accessibility. But just the fact is that it is not sustainable to just keep building our way out of traffic. We need to give alternatives. And so to me, transit is essential. And I still look at ridership as the North Star because for transit to provide benefits to the community, the buses, the trains, the ferries have to be carrying people, not be empty.
Yeah, it's interesting because we posted a number of articles last couple of days. One of them was with the University of Minnesota Transportation Center, the Accessibility Observatory, on how during the pandemic, traffic was so light that people had much greater access, even if they had a car. Atlanta, for example, people had access to 82% more jobs when the traffic was lighter because it wasn't so backed up and they were able to get places in faster times. And obviously we've heard about, how cars are getting more expensive. And so if it costs so much to get into the system at all, housing and transportation, then it's cost prohibitive to actually, operate in society, which is frustrating. But yeah, so another kind of metric question that I have for you, though, is, I want to talk about your report that you did for Seamless Bay Area, because I think it gets us a little bit deeper into the discussion, this question I have, which is that per capita ridership is most connected to per capita service hours more than anything else. And I'm wondering, that seems like the big finding of what you're talking about, or at least the big connecting point of what you're talking about. I'm wondering, what does it mean first, and then why that is, and why does it mean what it means?
Well, there's a couple ways of answering this question, but I think what it means is that, there's been a lot of efforts, a lot of talk, a lot of debate lately. How do we get riders back onto transit, particularly since the pandemic really cut into transit ridership? And I started this work for Seamless before the pandemic, and we said, well, let's finish it off. There's talk about free fares, there's talk about security, and they're all important, particularly security. I don't want to make it sound like I'm diminishing that importance, but to attract more customers to ride, or to get more people to ride transit, I always say there's a three-legged stool that the transit agency needs to focus on. And if you take one leg off, the stool falls over. The first is designing the service. And that is how frequently it runs, the span of service, how early and late it runs, and where it runs, and how quickly you can get from point A to point B. That's designing the product. That's number one. But if you design a great product that everyone is going to use, or that's going to be useful to a large percentage of the population, they need to know about it. They need to be enticed to sample it. That's the second leg, the marketing, the promotion, the public information piece of it. Now, let's say you succeeded in both those areas. Everyone knows about it. Then the third leg is the ongoing operations. Is the bus on time, or the train or the ferry on time? Is it clean? Do the people feel safe? Are the operators friendly and courteous? Is it reliable? Is it not going to just not be on time, but you don't have to worry about it breaking down while you're riding it? Those are the kind of the operational things. That's not going to bring people to transit, but that's going to, once they've sampled it, that's going to keep them coming back. If you fail in that area, people are going to stop using it. So you need to have all of those three elements together to maximize ridership. But the one piece of glue that you absolutely need gets back to that first leg, the service levels. If the service is well marketed, it's clean, shiny, what have you, the fare is free or the fare is low or whatever the fare is, the bus is running once an hour, or if it's a one-way loop, or if it's just only runs from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., it means that people aren't going to use it because it's just too inconvenient to use. And I think that's why the relationship of per capita service hours to per capita ridership is the strongest correlation. I first came across this idea in my first general manager's job, where I wanted to find 10 peer agencies and look at all of the particular measures that they had to compare how we were doing, but also to see where the strength was. And believe it or not, the only one I could find a correlation to was per capita ridership to per capita service hours. I could find a system that was crappy on-time performance, but still doing good with ridership, or vice versa. Now, I'm not advocating all those other things. I mean, they say you want to have all those three legs working together well, but the one piece of glue, and I like to say, well, it's like flour for a cake, even though there's flourless cakes. is that service level, because everything else supports it, but it all falls apart if you don't have a high level of service that's convenient for people to use to meet their accessibility needs.
It's interesting because, a lot of people talk about density. A lot of folks talk about other metrics. You mentioned there's access, there's other things that we can talk about, safety, et cetera. But the kind of the loss of focus on ridership itself seems, counterintuitive to providing service as well. I mean, like thinking about how we can, bring back transit systems, but not thinking about ridership. It seems off to me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that when I see we need to come up with other measures, I think that's kind of missing the point. I mean, accessibility is an important message, and I made reference to an article that David Zipper wrote a few years ago about accessibility. And while I agree with everything he said, but what is accessibility? How do you define accessibility? Well, it really gets back to, again, service levels. Also, if you're providing good accessibility, does that really matter if you're not carrying people? So that's where I still think that ridership is the North Star. I have often made this comment. I mean, I used to always tell my staff that transit dependency is not in our vocabulary. And this was probably something that I used to advocate and was very much misunderstood, because when I talked about we need to focus on choice riders, people kept thinking, well, that meant you're going to focus on high quality commuter express services and ignore people in the inner city. No, that's nothing about that at all. It has nothing to do with that aspect. What I mean by this is that I'd see people make comments like, affluent people, time is more important to them. So you mean timing isn't important to people that are not affluent? I mean, to me, that's very condescending. I guess what I'm getting at is that I felt that transit, when you talk about transit dependence in that sense, it subconsciously becomes condescending, that they'll take whatever crap we give them. And that's the point I'm trying to get to, that we can't look at it that way. We got to look at that everybody has a choice, and everybody does have a choice. They may not be good choices, they may be limited choices, but if we can't give high quality service to everyone, regardless where you're on the economic stratus or what have you, then we're not doing a good job. We have to be earning the choice of riders. Now, you mentioned density. Yeah, density is important. I mean, you're not going to be running service every 15 minutes if you have really, really low density. That's kind of a fourth element. And I didn't put that on my three-legged stool because I was looking at what the transit agency needs to do. The fourth element is the transit agency should be an advocate for transit supportive development. But as I found in Santa Clarita, which was built around the car, by focusing, we were still able to generate a good deal of transit ridership by providing a high quality service. So you're not going to get the same levels of service in Santa Clarita as you're going to get in San Francisco, because they're two completely different cities. But still focusing on ridership, providing as high a level of service as the density can support, is still a basic principle that applies to big or small systems.
I also want to know where the per capita is coming from. So per capita basically means per person, right? So
Mm-hmm.
a population, but it's spread out through a certain geography. And so when we talk about per capita, what are the geographies that we're talking about when we're comparing these systems to each other?
Well, one of the things is you try to look at the service area. And when I say service area, NTD, the National Transit Database, you have to report your service area, population, your service area, a square footage or square miles. And the way they say that is if you have fixed route service, anything that's within a 3/4 mile of a fixed route, if you have a station, train station, anything within a 3/4 mile circle of that route, and if you have dial a ride, wherever you're providing dial a ride service to. That's kind of the NTD, the National Transit Database definition of service area. For my analysis, I was basically using that for the United States, for Canada, just use whatever CUDA came up with. But it's, in theory, the population or the employment within that has access to transit. I have found that there's some places that are probably a bit more generous in how they define their population, but you just kind of have to work with that. But that's where the per capita comes from. is basically the population that does have access to transit service.
It's interesting because I go back to my work at Reconnecting America and the Center for TOD and thinking about transit ridership and what drives it. Right, a lot of the work that I did specifically was looking at densities and how they were connected, and a lot of the literature pointed to employment density being the big draw because a lot of transit trips were work trips, which is, we'll talk about that in a second compared to like what the pandemic means for that. But you look at back at Pushkarev and Zupan and their work in the 70s, thinking about what makes for a good, transit service and those types of things. I was always interested in kind of those connections. And then, when I started blogging in the early 2000s, thinking about, these weighted densities, trying to figure out where the density actually was and the perceived density, right? Like what the density felt like versus what the actual density is like. Because, there'll be people out there that say Los Angeles is denser than New York City. Or New York as a whole, which is true technically, but at the same time, there's the density feels different because of the hyperdensity of Manhattan and the lower density of some of the suburbs. So it's just an interesting discussion that continues to this day. But it makes me think of that when I think of like per capita density or per capita ridership or anything along those lines.
Well, one of the things I try to do in the report, if you notice, like when I was comparing Toronto to the Bay Area, I compared Toronto, the city, to San Francisco, the city, and then I compared the region, which of course, involves a lot of lower density areas, to the Bay Area, which is a region. And, I think you could probably get into much deeper details as far as different densities than what I did. But at the same time, I think that at the level I did it at, it still makes sense because one of the things that I found out that totally surprised me when I was looking at the Bay Area systems is I did a subset of the 27 Bay Area systems, the 20 systems that have bus service. This would exclude BART and Caltrain and WIDA and ACE and that. So what really surprised me was if you look at the top 5 systems for per capita ridership, they are the top 5 systems for per capita service that they provide. Number 1 being Muni. If you know anything about transit, you'd pick Muni's number 1. Number 2 is AC Transit. And they're number 2 both in those things. But number 3 in per capita service totally shocked me. And you read the report, so you know the answer to this. But it was WestCat. Now, I would never have picked WestCat as being number 3 in terms of per capita service, but they were also number 4 in per capita ridership. So it's like the correlation was there. I mean, for many of you people listening to this don't know what WestCat represents. It represents communities of Pinole and Hercules and Crockett, which is Western Contra Costa County. It's a suburban area. It's a hilly suburban area. If you look at the geography there, as well as the density, all those factors, you would never peg that to be high. Now, how did they come out? Well, part of it is because they were providing a very high level of service, connecting that area with a BART station. They also had some direct service into San Francisco, but they also provide, I think, a very high level of service, relatively speaking, for the environment they operated in. So there's nothing about the WestCat service area that says transit friendly or transit supportive, but somehow, they managed to do that. And I'd like to think that I succeeded in Santa Clarita when I was there. I mean, by the time I left, we were doing 3 million rides a year. This is a ex-urban area that was built around the car because there was no transit service until, it hit a population of 150,000. Well, there was an article today in the transit news about Birmingham, Alabama, and they mentioned, we're doing 2 million a year. Well, Birmingham, Alabama should be doing, of course, the whole article is about how they really need more service in Birmingham. That was the point of the article, but you have the suburban community, suburban LA community, which doesn't have the density or even the demographics that are supportive of transit that Birmingham has, and you're able to carry more people. So, I think that goes back to this thing that you give them great service, people will ride transit, even if it's in an environment that's not necessarily that supportive. Now, I'm not arguing for auto-centric development. I'd love to see less auto-centered development. I think the solution to when you hear about the doom loops, this is a little off the topic, but when you hear about the vacant office space in San Francisco or any other big city, I think, why can't we somehow move those auto-centric office spaces in the suburbs that are split around and move those jobs into the center cities where you have the transit infrastructure and the density? That it'd be nice if we could kind of use that as a way to get less auto-centered development. And then we can redevelop those suburban areas into mixed use housing projects. But anyway.
Well, that's a whole other discussion, I think, about people's love of short commutes and a bunch of other stuff. Well, so you found this about WestCat, you found this about the Bay Area agencies, there's so many of them, but then you also compared it to other agencies around Canada and the United States as well. Which of the agencies was most interesting to you?
Well, first of all, I found that, when you looked at the six largest Canadian metropolitan areas, you think about Edmonton or Calgary or very sprawling metropolitan areas. I think Canadian cities tend to have stronger downtowns than we have in the United States because they didn't do as much freeway building. But still, Edmonton and Calgary, the prairie, it's flat, they have plenty of land, so they're able to sprawl. And while they don't have the same level of transit ridership that you find in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal, they still exceed what you find here in the Bay Area or the North America in terms of per capita service and per capita ridership. So even with that less transit supportive development, they're still, able to succeed very well. I also found that, I remember back in sometime in the 80s, Toronto was bragging that they had the highest fare in North America. Now, bear in mind, trying to compare Canadian and United States fares might be a little tricky, but I think they were right. I think that even if you did the conversion, it'd still be they had the highest fare in North America, but they also had the highest per capita ridership in North America. And the point is that fares really isn't driving it, it's probably service levels. So I was expecting Toronto to be the top dog in Canada, but it was actually Montreal actually has much higher per capita ridership and per capita service than Toronto does, both TTC as well as the metropolitan area. So that was kind of another surprising finding. And, I think as you see from the report, if the Bay Area is trying to match Montreal, we would need something like to increase our service by 73% to match it. And the thing is in Montreal, they're still expanding service. They're still adding service,
Yeah, they just opened that regional rail line.
Right. So, Vancouver, I made a reference in the blog from February, but I just saw something this week that in British Columbia, they said that they're back at 100% pre-pandemic ridership.
So what that tells us is that basically they have really high service levels, they have really high per capita ridership. So the Bay Area is underserving the population is kind of the idea that comes out of this.
That's correct. And the fact is that the Bay Area is probably, comparatively speaking, throughout the United States, does have much higher levels of service and higher levels of ridership, but it is still being underserved.
So what does that mean in terms of if you wanted to make the Bay Area more like Montreal, what would it take to do something like that?
Well, I think might be a little bit off the question, but one of the things that I see people that tend to be critical of transit saying, well, we need to right size our service levels. And usually they mean as well, cut service. And then they point to the fact, well, we don't have as many commuters commuting in, so we need to write fewer peak hours trips. Well, that's fine. That's okay. The thing is, what we need to have, what Montreal or any of these Canadian cities have, is basically a high level of service all day long, 7 days a week, that's accommodating all trip purposes. I think one thing during the pandemic, you heard people talk about, well, we need to focus more on essential workers who aren't working 9 to 5 and what have you, which was all true. But I recall, probably one of the things that influenced me in my career was before I even started working at AC Transit, I lived in San Francisco. Muni was going through their first total restructuring of service. And, as a transit geek, I made sure I went to every meeting and started talking with the planners. Things that stood out at me was a slide that said 70% of the trips in San Francisco are not to downtown, and 77% of the trips in San Francisco are not work trips. And this was back in the late 70s. And that always sort of stuck with me thinking that, we need to focus not just on work trips to downtowns, but we need to focus on all trips in the region. We need to build multi-destinational networks that provide service all the time. Now, bear in mind, I don't want this to be taken as a critique of the transit systems that exist in the Bay Area, because from that standpoint, as far as the amount of service that transit agencies are provided is based on the resources they have. So I want to make it clear that I don't want people to come away thinking that I'm being critical, saying that the Bay Area systems are doing a crappy job because they don't provide the same level of service as Toronto or that. They don't have the resources to do it. They can't. If I were managing any one of these systems, I might have figured out some things or another, but without additional dollars, I would probably not be able to put any more service on the road than what they are. So this is not intended to be a critique of the transit agencies that they're somehow hoarding resources and not putting it out in service. They're putting out what they can put out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's a critique, but it's a critique of politics, I think, and
Yeah.
what people understand. I mean, there was just a Mercury News piece about a survey that was done on, people's feelings about a new ballot measure in the Bay Area. And, people were still very supportive, but it wasn't as high as it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Because California is so strange in the way that we do votes for transportation, we have to have 2/3 votes for things. So if you're not getting 66 to 70% of the vote, then it's really hard to pass stuff. They might change that in the legislature or whatever. But basically, there was a lot of people saying like, oh, they have enough money, or, the agencies, like you said, need to be right-sized. And I think that's a misunderstanding of how we get back to the core of providing people service that gets higher ridership, right? Cutting service has never led to higher ridership.
No,
and so, we need that resource. And that is a political critique. And I think it's an accurate political critique, because we can always pour more resources into transit, because the road system has tons of resources that they pour into that system continuously. And nobody's ever saying you need to right size the road system. So, it's funny that we have this kind of bifurcated discussion about transportation when it's all a network, right? It's all connected.
And I think that's a key thing. It's a network. And that's probably the other piece where maybe we can do a better job, is working seamlessly as a network. I do see some things that, I find troubling occasionally as far as, trying to better coordinate service. I do think that some better integration, it's hard work. It really is hard work. And there is some probably work on fares, and MTC's doing this. MTC's trying to come up with, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission here in the Bay Area is trying to come up with an integrated fare structure, integrated wayfinding, as well as to come up with a way to better integrate services. But there also, when you look at the regional map, there are some gaps. But again, that gets back to the politics, because before you fill any gap, you need the resources to provide that service.
Yeah. I also find, your discussion about San Francisco really interesting, and going back to the 70s, because right now there are so many routes that are actually, around 100% of their ridership, or even higher in the case of Van Ness, where they have the new bus rapid transit line. And so that's interesting too, is all of these routes that I see that are crowded when I get on, the 24, the 22, the J, places like that, they're not going to downtown. The J does, I guess it goes into the subway, but the 22 and the 24 don't, but they're always packed because people are going to destinations along the route. And I think that's a really important kind of point to make, is that if you create a system that will get you to all the destinations, then you can provide that service and get that ridership pretty high, actually. And it's not downtown centric.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, like, for example, AC Transit's 1T, it doesn't go from downtown Oakland, but basically it's carrying people along the International Boulevard corridor between San Leandro and downtown Oakland. Again, that is carrying more people than pre-pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. So then politically, what do we need to do to increase service levels? Like, if we wanted to increase service level to a level of Montreal, or if we wanted to do it to Toronto or other places that have these high per capita ridership, high per capita service levels, and we wanted to, say, increase, 35% or something like that, if we average all those things like you did in the report, what does it take? What's the value that we need to pull out of the air in order to make it happen?
Well, obviously it takes dollars. And first of all, you have operating dollars to sustain it. and capital dollars because you're going to need more vehicles and probably more maintenance. And I can't give you a dollar figure, but it's going to take funding. But then how do you get the funding? How do you deal with the politics? Whether you're going to the voters or going to the legislature or both, how do you get there? Unfortunately, there's been a lot of bad press about transit in terms of safety. And I don't want to downplay it because incidents happen, but then there's plenty of times that things don't happen. And agencies probably, I think the perception of transit that it's unsafe needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Let me put it that way, that you need to address that. That wasn't necessarily an issue pre-pandemic, but that has become an issue right now. I think that to the extent that agencies can adapt their schedules and service to the new reality based on the resources they have. I mean, BART just redid their schedule. Caltrain's actually running more off-peak service. I'm kind of disappointed that Caltrain ridership hasn't rebounded, given the fact I think they're doing the right thing schedule-wise. We'll see how BART's modifications work, but I think, again, they're doing the right thing. AC Transit is doing a realigned project, which I'm working on actually, which hopefully we're able to find some creative ways to provide more service with existing resources in the AC Transit service area that I think, projects like that. But we need more money, but to get more money, people need to feel that transit is doing a good job. And any things we can do to enhance services, to make it more attractive with the resources we have. Samtrans just did a realignment. I understand they're having some success ridership-wise as well. WIDA is having some success with the things they're doing. We'll still have to see what happens with BART. And then, as I say, we have AC Transit next year. We'll be doing a realignment that hopefully will again show the same kind of results of saying, hey, we're doing a lot better. We've got limited resources. And we got to get the driver shortage dealt with. I mean, that's the other big problem is that, many agencies, including AC Transit, could be providing more service with the dollars they have, but not, they don't have enough employees to do that. So we got to get that fixed. And then, it's not only needs some more long-term sustained funding to get that higher level, we also have a short-term fiscal cliff that has to be addressed. Worst thing to do is you cut a whole bunch of service just before you go to the voters and say, well, we just cut all this service, but we need more money. It's complicated. It's not a silver bullet. Funding is the key thing, but there's a lot of working pieces that have to be put into place in order to get the funding.
Yeah. In addition, I mean, I like this idea of increasing service hours, and I hope the discussion continues because I think it's really important. And I think that we do need more service. It's really annoying when you have to wait 15 minutes for a J versus 10 minutes for a J or 5 minutes for a J, right? Like there's a time period that you're waiting that makes you feel like you might not want to come back the next time. But if it's short enough, you feel like, you can hop on at any time. So the service levels really do matter in pulling in people. But I'm also wondering if there's some sort of a rethink we need to do on capital investments, right? So let's consider the Van Ness BRT. That's actually changed travel times dramatically. It's increased riderships. We probably should have more discussions about making some of these, pinpoint specific changes to certain intersections or things like that. The kind of stuff that the Swiftly advocates for anyways. I think those things are really important too. So, the discussion of service hours, but also maybe talking about, what is the thing that's going to make the service more valuable over the longer term?
Well, I would agree with that. And that's another way of getting more service hours, particularly on, high density routes. Whereas if you can speed up the service, then a bus can make more trips. You can provide more trips with the same number of dollars. It also makes the service more attractive. And this is where, sometimes even this is where perception actually works in your favor because, I was up in Eugene and we put in the BRT, the MX BRT, the perceived time savings was greater than the actual time savings. So there it was a good thing that people perceived it to be better, worked in our favor. But, the thing is what we have to try to avoid is making it a 10-year project. And it doesn't have to be. I think there's a lot of little things that, we have the technology for signal priority and signal preemption, and that is much better. Simple things is on bus stop locations. Some of the work TMD did down in LA, they had, for example, they did the rapid routes, which made, limited stops. And then they had overlaid on a local route. What we recommended down there was reduce the number of stops on the local route, but still have more stops than you had on the rapid, and just combine the service together so you were able to provide a much higher frequency consistently along that corridor that was also consistently maybe not as fast as the rapid, but much faster than the local. And that concept allowed you to provide more service with existing resources. So there are a number of imaginative things you can do to speed up service. And if you speed up service, you can provide more service. So it's a double whammy because the faster service makes it attractive just in itself. I can get, like on Van Ness, I can get from here to there much quicker. But then you also providing the more frequency. So it is a double pleasure. And I think we need to find ways we can do it economically. I mean, that's a whole nother topic, and I don't have the answers to how we can build more stuff cheaper and faster in this country, but we need to. We need to figure out. I mean, there's been a lot of work done, and NYU's done stuff, showed the way, but that needs to get done. But in the meantime, I think we also need to look at sort of more, not as flashy, but still ways that we can speed up service. And if we speed up service, we can provide more service with existing resources.
Why do you think we haven't made ridership a national goal?
I don't know. Um, I mean, earlier in my career, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I was trying to get APTA, the American Public Transit Association, to make this a major focus. And I'm kind of at a loss at how come we haven't. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, this might be not answering your question directly, but one of the things that comes with funding is that it's easier to get capital funds than it is to get operating funds. Capital funds, you can get, they're one-time things. There's always a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking or stuff like that to go with it. Operating funds, is like there's this, oh, it's just going to go in a black hole, or it's just going to, oh, the unions are going to just get more money, or the federal, this is a state, the states is local. I mean, it's just operating funds isn't sexy, it isn't thing, and it's really hard to get operating funds, and to provide more service requires more operating funds. Now, bear in mind, I make my living helping transit agencies do more with less, or do more with the resources they have. And I think we as a firm have been very successful at doing that. And it's very rewarding when you can come up with a good idea, you can streamline service, you can improve service, and you're doing it with the resources they have. But even after that's all said and done, that's just like your first phase. You still don't have as much service out there as you should. And that gets back to operating funds. And that basically, that's just hard to get that level of funding at any level of government. I would say that maybe people know that for ridership to grow, you need more service and you need more funds, and it gets back to that. I don't really have a good answer as to why ridership is not a national goal, but I wish it were. I do wish it were. And I still, when I look at any project, I say, what can we do with the resources we have to get more ridership? And we've had success. We can point to a lot of successes, but even with our successes, there's always more that you could do if you had more resources.
Yeah, I think that's, we should be able to do more with more, right? Instead of
Yeah,
more with less.
Yeah. And the thing is, I could agree. I'm not one that says you just want to throw money at it.
Yeah,
because,
right.
You don't want to just throw money at it and to be wasted. I mean, that's the worst thing to do. And I think there's a fear of that also, that if we put more money into it, it's going to be wasted, which means that there need to be, I've always been an advocate of tying funding to metrics, and that's gets a little, I think there's some discomfort there as well. What if we don't meet the metrics? But, I do think that that is a concern that, if you throw more money at it, it's going to be wasted. You don't want to do that, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that money is being used. There's a definite return on investment, as it were. And what is that return on investment? Really gets back to ridership, because, again, when you talk about equity, you talk about access, they're important metrics. But if people aren't taking advantage of your service, what good is the access you're providing? What good is the equity you're providing? Those metrics are important to show that you're providing a valuable service. But the end of the day, the result's got to be people using the system. It's got to be the ridership that results from an equitable system and an accessible system.
So what should we take away from the paper that you worked on with Seamless, and like what are the next steps in trying to figure out, how to get this larger amount of service, maybe politically, or is there something we can sign to ask for it? Is there a petition? What's the next steps?
Well, I don't know if there's a petition or thing like that, but and I'll let Seamless answer that question. But I would say that the takeaway is that, we need to be providing more service. We need to be thinking about how we can get strategically, how we can get the resources to provide that more service. The strategic thinking, there's not a silver bullet, has a lot of moving parts. I think, the transit agencies need to be showing that they're doing a good job. And I'm not saying that they aren't, but if the polling shows that people are kind of lukewarm, that says that more needs to be done. I think we need to be showing, MTC has been pushing, integrated fares and integrated wayfinding, and is looking at possibly a network manager type of thing. I think that those things need to progress, because then I think the public will see, that there is some progress on that. I think that, for any kind of funding, it needs to be clear as what that funding buys. And there's got to be some kind of follow through to make sure that if the funding comes through, that at the end of the day, we're not going to see it's like, well, where's that service we promised? There's got to be some kind of mechanisms in there to make sure that the funding is being used for what it was promised to be used. That it's not just because, as I say, if you just they give us funding and trust us, people aren't going to say no. They got to see what they're buying, and they got to see some sort of guarantee that they're going to get that at the end of the day. And I think that the work that we're doing for AC Transit, we're not only doing a constrained plan to be implemented in the fall of 2024, but we're also showing what the service should be if we had the resources that are available. MTC, I think, through its Transit 2050 plan, that's being more at a regional level. So we need the funding, but we need to make sure that we look at all the steps that are needed to build the support for that funding.
Awesome. I'll link the report in the show notes. Where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
Well, I'll give you my email address, I guess. It's rkilcoyne, RKILCOINE, at tmdinc.net. But you can reach me through there, and I'll be happy to reach out to anyone. As I say, I make my living trying to help transit systems do more with less, or with what they have, and feel that we as a firm have been very successful in that endeavor. But at the same time, the other side of me is a transit evangelist that says we need to grow transit beyond that. We need more resources, but we also understand that we got to make sure that those resources are spent properly, and we got to earn the support of the public and the legislators to do that.
Yeah. Well, Ron, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.